Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session on designing a new work culture that embraces and celebrates racial equity and diversity. I am Pelin Demirel, a senior lecturer of innovation and enterprise at Dyson School of Design and Engineering, Imperial College London. And today I have the pleasure of moderating this session with Margot Sandy, one of our PhD researchers, who also specializes on diversity in innovation teams. We have two fantastic speakers today, Nigel Prentice and Jessica Tremblay, who are leading IBM's Racial Equity in Design initiative. And we are very much looking forward to today's conversation, hearing about their journey in implementing this initiative. On that note, I'll hand over to Margot to introduce our speakers in a little bit detail, and then we'll start with the Q&A.
Thank you, Pelin. Looks like we have a healthy audience joining us today. I see the numbers are rising, and that's a good thing for numbers to be rising in this forum here. Thanks again for everyone attending this event, and we're very fortunate to have these two dynamic speakers today. They are leaders in the industry and doing some very important work to influence the culture at IBM. First, we have Nigel Prentice, who has worked in numerous areas across the technology space, from founder of the first digital product consultancy in Austin, Texas, to working in government institutions, to studio leader and user experience consultancies. He joined IBM in 2014. Taking on different executive roles where he instituted a design thinking approach. And currently Nigel is the design executive for the global digital growth and commerce team at IBM and leads IBM's Racial Equity in Design initiative. Next, we have Jessica Tremblay, another leader dedicated to IBM's Racial Equity in Design initiative. She joined IBM as a visual designer and front-end developer, but since then she has had various roles throughout the organization. She has led numerous design thinking events across the globe with what seems like a very high focus on community and connection. And Jessica is not only a leader inside of IBM, but outside of IBM. She's involved in several initiatives that encourage women to be part of tech and pursue leadership roles. So with that said, both of these speakers are engaged in a long-term commitment to a company transformation around closing the racial equity gap in the profession of design. So please give me, or join me, sorry, please join me in giving our speakers a warm welcome.
Thank you, Margot. I appreciate that introduction. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for having us. As I prepared and we thought about this talk, I was struck by a couple of similarities between IBM, our institution, and your institution, sort of the old and the new, the Imperial College from early last century, 1907, I believe, and then the Dyson School of Design Engineering being a more recent creation, sort of parallels what we've done with design at IBM. IBM is also over 100 years old and in fact has had a couple of transformations to rebirth design at the company. And I think this modern interpretation of both the past and the present is something we both share. So I'm going to jump into a few slides, and I'm not going to take long. I really want to get to the conversation. So please do ask Jessica and myself questions in the chat. That racial equity in design is clearly what we would love to share with you. But listen, if you've got other questions about the design program at IBM and what the heck it is that we do, happy to answer. All right, here we are. So, non-nerd, father of two, these two little ones here. This is Kenai and Kalia, my beautiful wife. I certainly married up, that's for sure. This is what we do professionally. This is IBM. We're redoing an internal brand name redo, so don't worry about the acronym soup. The point is that I help run a division that thinks all day about the digital representation of experiences for our clients and partners. And I've got a team that does that. But listen, I want to tell you about a journey. journey that starts really in the last century with my grandparents. This is Rufus Prentice Sr. and Minnie Prentice, who gave birth to my father here, and that is a young Nigel, strapping 3-year-old on the Stillman College campus. Sometimes I'll do a Q&A just right here. Stillman College is the separate but equal school compared to the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. So this is 1976, as my father shows here. And just 10 years before this, 1966, my father was prevented from going to the University of Alabama and told that he had to go to Stillman, which is a historically black college in that city. So an interesting thread there that I'm going to come back and visit in a little bit. Now, this is me in my heyday on my campus, University of Texas at Austin. The guy with the mustache there in the back. I don't know which R&B group we thought we were, but we were certainly doing something. This is kind of what happened not too long after that. 1995, I began as a support engineer at Apple. And I don't know if y'all remember, but for most of the 1900s, if I should say, Apple and IBM were locked in a battle to the death. And I thought it was pretty funny that the year that I joined IBM, Apple and IBM shook hands and started selling each other's stuff. Been at the company here for almost 8 years at IBM and became a design executive not too long ago. One of my design heroes, Don Norman, I was able to meet him and work with him a few times. And my other hero is my son here, using our IBM Studios Austin as a Playdate location for him and his mini Lego kits. And listen, I just want to share a few thoughts about design at IBM. This is Thomas Watson Jr., who famously said, "Good design is good business." This is 1966. And this is Phil Gilbert. And if you see my hush puppies on the left, you'll good for you. Where's Waldo in this photo? But this is us kicking off, I think, a fireside chat, Jessica, if I remember correctly, in our IBM Studios Austin building. Just as a symbol of what we were redoing with the company. We were teaching the company new tricks. And so this is how we did it. That simple formula on the bottom. IBM has just about 350,000 employees. And so we said, how do we scale this idea of culture, of human centricity within our culture? Well, the answer is people, practices, and places. Those three elements resulting in outcomes. So bringing in the right folks, empowering them with the practices, enterprise design thinking primarily, and these formally built studios became the way that we attracted over 2,500 formally trained designers in just about 5 years, with just about the entire company having taken some level of badging to get awareness around human-centric methods, at least 1 or 2 methods, and then over our 50 global studios locations. And so don't just take my word for it. Of course, we have a study that we always point to. It doesn't everyone have a study that they need to point to if they're an enterprise. 200% faster time to market using design thinking by IBM for our clients. This is as reported by our clients. 75% reduced design time and reduced development time. More fancy numbers that essentially say the same thing. Now, all that's well and good. That was 2013 to about 2020. And as you remember, 2020 was a bit of a struggle for the world, but not us at that moment. This is in the middle of the pandemic, but we're at an Airbnb, socially distancing a pool party for ourselves, sort of a staycation. And the irony is this was on August 23rd of that year, which was the same day that this happened. This tweet came out. Jacob Blake broke up a fight and got shot. This gentleman was involved in the repercussions after that. This is Jacob Blake himself. Say their name. The city across the country were on fire, and actually across the globe, we saw this in the headlines. Obviously, not a good look for us, not a good look for humanity, in my opinion, and it's really just too much. Policing is an issue, and yes, design can work on this problem. And what can we do right now? How might we, in other words, create a space to feel comfortable in the face of continued social justice issues? The answer really is design at IBM. And so this is what we focused on. How can we tangibly and sustainably impact the experience of Black designers at IBM and beyond? Racial equity is steeped in lots of institutions. And at IBM, we have our mission statement for design, which is to create a sustainable culture of design thinking at the company. And so what we're adding to that is saying that we can't achieve that cultural outcome if we don't also achieve equity. And so, what do? I got busy with this group here. This is a leadership team of senior Black designers that we got together. And if you'll notice, we call these people first pillar leads. And the idea is that we are paired up and we invited the second pillar. And it's not that we needed an advisory council or a board, because listen, Black folks can't do it alone. We too often have been, sort of told, oh, there's a problem that's affecting you. Let us know what you want to do to fix it, and then we'll talk about it. That's not what this is. As you can imagine, anything that has one pillar is fine, but anything that has two pillars is probably more than twice as strong. And these are the folks that are equally yoked in the problem space, if you will, involved in not just the human-centric design of social institutions inside our company and beyond, but part of the solution in a way in which they wanted to be activated. So this equal pairing of pillars, I think, is a hallmark of our approach, and one that really speaks to how we're changing the culture inside the company. We got all of our designers together. Phil Gilbert, at the time, the GM of design at the company, just really asked us all to get together, not knowing what to do next. In terms of, if you'll remember, in those first months after George Floyd, really no one knew exactly what to do next. So what did we do as designers but say, yes, we've got to do something sustainable, but not only that, we got to get out some sticky notes. We're designers, come on. And so we understood, got the pulse in the sense of what is important to our people. This is the community of designers speaking out of what to do and how to do it. This is just an artifact of one of our first community calls. And this is what resulted in it. Essentially, 8 work streams, which has kind of blossomed into a few more since then. I want to draw your attention to top left, career success. We know that we are woefully behind in the representation of Black folks, really all underrepresented minorities in the field of design. So how do we just simply increase the numbers? Because at least if we get more numbers, we have a fighting chance to then work on culture. It's not a singular faceted approach, it's multifaceted. We also have our value statements inside of our call to action. All of this, by the way, is on our website at racialequityindesign.com. We're also designing a new language. This is a area globally, and especially in the US, that's difficult to have these conversations many times. We in the States, we've got Thanksgiving come up, and this is famous for family disruption around politics, church, and now race. And so we're going to try to avoid that at work, at least, by designing a way for thought provoking conversations to happen that are meaningful among manager and employee, and as well as among employees themselves. Truth in numbers is holding a mirror up to ourselves. Can we report the right numbers and therefore chart a path forward? I was lucky enough to start a podcast. I think we're about 9 episodes in. Please check us out on Spotify. More about that in a second. And several other items that Jessica will talk about here in just a second. And so this is sort of our bouquet of offerings around racial equity and design at IBM. And if you know anything about IBM's 90s technology, we did everything out in the open source community. And this is all presented in the open as well. Podcast, website, and our field guide is a downloadable PDF that I'd love for you to check out and give us feedback on. Here we go, just a few detail slides here. Field guide, podcast, where I really talk about the experience of being Black in our industry. It's not a civil rights history lesson for those in the States. It's also not a bashing session. It's about the conversation. Everyone's got a unique journey, and we love to hear about those journeys in this long form format. Also, for that career success, we realized that, listen, HR in corporate, human resources, doesn't have all the answers. And in fact, they struggle to attract talent many times from our underrepresented population. So what we decided to do was test a hypothesis. Could we go into the social realm online social, and sponsor a few things, and what can we do to jumpstart our pipeline? So we partnered with this brother here, Professor Omari Souza, just down the street here in Texas, and he was able to put together with our assistance a conference last spring, Black Design Past, Present, Future, and we're in negotiations or conversations to do a part two this coming out spring. But the idea was that he brought together plenty of speakers, and we had an impact that I'd love to share with you in just a second. The whole idea was just to be seen in this industry. Many of us go through this entire day or week or career being the only one in the room. Can we turn that on its ear? And at least for this weekend, we were able to. And this is the results of that racial equity in design. These are from attendees, far left. Okay, IBM, I see you. I'm intrigued now. Also, I've never seen so many impactful, truthful, delightful Black designers in one space. It was epic. I'm definitely going to apply to some of your jobs. And then on the far right, this is what's important is from what I was talking about, the second pillar, the non-Black folks. This is a hiring manager. They were able to hire somebody and give us this feedback. And then what the candidate said who just applied and got hired was, y'all are making a community and a welcoming home for Black designers in the industry. So this is the case study, I think, in how to go to market to attract talent. It's more about personal connections than the broad branding statements that a lot of companies are doing. In addition to this conference route, we've also had the opportunity to take a few moments on television. And so there's a television show called America by Design, which is part of the By Design family of seasons, started out of Australia. Actually, myself and Shani Sandy, two of our design executives at IBM, were able to be judges for 30 projects covering all sorts of domains in design. And not only that, we created for the first time ever the IBM Empower Award, where I was able to pick an organization and a project that was making a difference with regards to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so we're going to talk about that here in a little bit as well, because I think that's part of the portfolio here, is recognizing that it's great if we can make a difference internally in the company. But isn't it better if we, for example, create new entrants into the field itself and have this conversation in a public space among those who are not typically having design nerd conversations? And absolutely, I'm a design nerd. So this is not about us. This is about the people that are watching. This is a primetime show on CBS, also online. You can go to America by Design TV and see these episodes right now. Let's jump into a few other parts of what we think the offerings made a difference. And Jessica, I'd love for you to jump in and talk a bit about these items here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Nigel. So one of the, and Nigel touched on this earlier, but one of the biggest impacts that we had was talking to our users. And that's what you do with design thinking, right? Design research, talk to people, find out their problems, find out their blockers. And so we found when talking to candidates, and specifically Black candidates, that a lot of them were, they had questions about interviewing. They had questions about specifically also design portfolios. So we had both portfolio and interview coaching workshops before we did the conference sponsorship in order to get them everything that they needed to be prepared so that when they did go to interview for design positions in the industry, they were ready to go. They had everything prepared. And this is how we were able to achieve a sense of equity for these candidates. But we also created one-to-one human relationships with them too, just help them answer questions. I know that when corporations tend to go scale with a lot of their HR processes, right, it feels cold, it feels inhuman. So we were able to be people and humans behind the HR and the recruiting process in order to, yeah, just help them, make them feel like, you know, they were being a part of something and get them prepared. So. And then one of the other cool things we did over the summer, we participated in the IBM Accelerate program, which is where the company went out, worked with HBCUs, and got students enrolled in different tracks. And we had a design track where we had 53 students. I know it's a small number, but that's a really big impact when it comes to Black designers and designers of color in the industry. But got them up to speed. Like, what are the introductions to design, if you will, for user experience, for visual design, for design research. And then also to help with the equity part, we got them fast tracked into being first runner-ups for IBM internships and also early career positions. So that was really cool and really fun to be a part of. And then, yeah, Nigel, we can skip that slide. We talked about Project Osmosis earlier. And then one of the really just things we're super proud of this year is we created a new position here internally called the Honorary IBM Design Scholar. And our inaugural recipient is Dr. Cheryl D. Miller. If you have not had a chance to learn about her and read about her, she's amazing. She has such a interesting and just historic lived experience as a Black designer with growing up during segregation, and her family too, but she is our first recipient into this position. So she will bring that lived experience to help us understand from design at IBM what we can do to bring more equity into the industry. And she's also going to work with some of our leaders also just as business, like how do we help bring equity into business. So we've got 3 pillars for her to focus in on here for her tenancy. And be working with the design profession and industry, getting out there externally, helping designers career success with their with giving them support and mentoring and career acceleration. And then, like I said earlier, working with the business and figuring out, yeah, equity is good for business. How do we help with IBM's go-to-market?
So the idea here is encapsulated here. No individual has any right to come into the world and go out of it without leaving behind them distinct and legitimate reasons for having passed through it. And I think this is important as I look at this little screen here, because it reminds me of why I'm doing it, why I'm coming to work every day, why I am working around the primary work that IBM pays me to do around digital systems, but then secondly, pushing for equity. And the whole idea was, you remember my son Kenai here playing Legos? That's a studio that he was in. And I'd hate for him to have these same conversations about why can't we have sustainable equity in this field or some other field, 20 years from now when he's moving into management. And so won't you join us, not just me, not just Jessica, but join us who have this desire to make a better future. We think the idea of the citizen designer is what we need here. You don't have to have gone to design school, engineering school, or school for social work to make a difference. Download our field guide, and in it are thought starters, we think, to help us make a difference. It's about the conversation and the journey, not about where we are today.
Thank you, Nigel and Jessica, for that great presentation. I'll start with a question. What are some of the most important questions and perhaps some of the most challenging questions you're asking in your teams as you design this initiative and as you're implementing the initiative?
Meaning the teams that we are directing, or the teams that we're trying to influence and have adoption of this work?
Both.
Both, yeah. One of the most recent questions, and I'd love Jessica for you to jump in as well, is why Black designers? Why not other ethnicities? And from the beginning, we've had an answer for that. That starts off by recognizing that a rising tide helps all boats, and that has come to the forefront when we realize that through our research that becoming a new employee at IBM, applying and going through that process is quite difficult. And Jessica hinted at it a little bit. We're full of bureaucracy. You can't be 100 years old with 300,000 employees and not have a ton of middle managers making things bureaucratic. And that hurts the design profession. We're not a big profession compared to the other engineers and whatnot at our company. So we uncovered that sort of suboptimal touch point in our HR process be through our work. And we can uncover several more. And so the whole company is going to improve those. That's the rising tides piece. But here's the other piece of it. In the United States, we have this peculiar history that came from our founding as a country. From the moment that Europeans landed here to 300 plus, almost 400 years later, there has not been a proper reckoning of the free labor that this economy benefited from. Not to mention the social injustice of me not knowing my ancestors' names. Hispanic folks, well, and I love every culture. In fact, my grandfather is from the Philippines. My grandmother is Native American. In many cases, they can call home to Mexico, to the UK, to England, to Nigeria even. They might still have their last names. They might enjoy their food. They might have the ability to remember their religions and their holidays. And none of that came over from 1619 onwards, when the first slave ships is generally recognized as being here. So from the very time Columbus came here and enslaved the first native folks he saw, there has not been a resolution of this peculiar history. And that's what we're saying. And we also have our children here, the little ones. Yeah. And that's what we're saying, is that we've got to be able to solve at least some aspect of this equity question. We've got to be able to solve, and if not solve, address this for this Black population. There has been systemic, institutionalized, and accepted detriments that just have not been fixed. And in our small way, if we can fix one, profession within one company and maybe inspire a few others, that's why we're doing what we're doing. So that's the biggest question. I think that it just goes, it's difficult to try to resolve is how long are we going to focus on Black folks perhaps, and how do we deal with that? Jessica, what other questions have come up that we have to deal with?
Yeah, I think there's a lot that we deal with. Hey, I want to hire designers of color into these roles I have. Do you have a pipeline, or do you know where to go to find them? And so we do a lot of I guess just pushing people in the right direction, giving them guidance. And that's actually some of the work that we're going to be doing here in the upcoming year, because since we are getting a lot of those questions, right? I feel like there could be a handbook of sorts that we could hand out to some of these hiring managers, like here's best practices. And we also did a lot of research into, okay, we hired, a good amount of Black designers this year, like what parts of the process worked, what didn't. In the job description, what made sense, what didn't make sense, what should we include for future job descriptions. So it's just making sure and ensuring that our hiring managers and our teams are geared up and they know, right, what to do to help bring equity into the hiring process.
And Jessica, if I could just quickly follow up on that last point, could you briefly tell us a little bit about some of the initiatives you have to train these hiring managers?
So that's the work. We're trying to figure out what is it that we're trying to do. So the cool thing is we have those folks. We have about 5 or 6 newly hired Black designers who are going to help us work through that process. Yeah. Two more to come. We don't know what those are quite yet, and those processes still need to be designed and figured out. But yeah, we're going to figure out, like, if there's a field guide of sorts or a playbook we can get.
Yeah, for hiring managers, and also being a role model is an important piece of it. And I think there's a question in the chat about, are there role models out there that we would recommend? So first of all, we've got to role model ourselves, role model among ourselves how to build a diverse and empowered team. It's important to point out and recognize that diversity doesn't exist as altruism. That's not why we're here. That's not why we're doing it. That plays a role sometimes, for sure. But the idea is that a diverse and empowered team is more powerful than a homogenous team. we're going to, the world is smaller than it ever has been. And so it's important for the diversity of ideas, diversity of ethnicities, diversities of backgrounds of all sorts come into play. And if I build a design team that is diverse and equitable, and I get to an outcome that others also need to get to an outcome, now I'm a role model. I'm not bragging in that moment. I'm just saying that this is a business case as well. And businesses need to understand on their terms many times why they should act a certain way. And that's how we're also pairing up programmatic things that teach people, but also just doing and being it and getting to a better outcome is another piece of that answer as well.
Okay, we have a bunch of questions coming through the chat right now. The first one here is, do you feel that gender equity works hand in hand with racial equity, and how is that being addressed through your initiatives?
Absolutely, and I think that's part of this concept. I kind of glossed over it when I said diverse and empowered teams. When you go through our enterprise design thinking framework, which is how we taught hundreds of thousands of non-designers to think like designers using design thinking, we talk about a particular principle: diverse and empowered teams. And the first population that we worked with on that is this idea of gender equity. And so IBM is a very progressive company, and the design program probably even more so. And so we took particular action, and I don't have all the details, but in sort of that 2017-18 timeframe, we increased our representation of women in new hires tremendously through some very specific programming. And so we think that there's lots of directions I could go. But I will kind of go back to some of the research that I've read, that women actually are more empathetic, I'm sorry. And there are studies that show that empathetic leaders make better executives. And so as we have, and because women tend to fill that role a bit better, we have many strong executive leaders at our company, having nothing to do with our initiative. It's just when you think about this idea of diverse and empowered teams, you cannot turn your back on any of the groups that need to exist in that framework. Jessica, did you have anything else would you like to add to that one?
No, you got it.
All right.
We have another question. It's quite detailed. So the first part of it asks how IBM defines racial equity in design. Do you have a working definition of that? And also asking about any racial equity frameworks that you would endorse.
So from a definition standpoint, it's difficult to, as you can imagine, and that's why the question is so important. We started from a simple place. We were able, we can't share these specific numbers, but we were able to do something historically you can't do. We asked HR for race-based data of employees, and we got that data. And then we compared it to the numbers and you guys can Google this on your own, the AIGA industry report of ethnic population in the design program, which is North America based. And the whole point is the whole industry is from a quantitative standpoint, is not diverse. So if you just look at the name of our group, racial equity, we at least need to address equity along the numerical dimension first to get to the word equity, right? So we're not trying to be equal. That implies that we're starting from the same place, but how do we give support in the areas that need it in order to get to at least a numerical equity from a representation standpoint? So that's point number one. From there, we enter sort of this idea that social scientists understand, which is culture. And we at IBM use this approach. My buddy Adam Culler uses this definition of culture for an organization equals behaviors over time. And if anybody here is from the social sciences, you know that there are no shortage of definitions of culture. So that's our approach for the second half of that definition of racial equity design. What are the behaviors over time that are observable that contribute to the culture of equity? We will either have attrition of those folks that we recruit or not. we could, attract 100% more Black candidates. But if 50% of those people attrit, that was not successful. That would be 3 or 4 times the standard rate of attrition. So we get to look at things like that. We also get to look at time in band before promotion. We get to look at pay scale. We can look at some of these lagging indicators of culture. And that becomes the rest of the definition. So I don't think that we have a perfect definition of racial equity design. We do know that it starts with numerical representation, which by the way, also speaks to how many Black folks are in management positions, how many women are in management and executive positions, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that we're just getting started on this journey. I'm at the helm of it now, but we might be looking at other dimensions of racial equity going forward. And I think that the definition will firm up over time. For right now, we've got to get the numbers, we got to get warm bodies and seats first, and then we can continue to push on culture. Those are the two sort of hemispheres of this work that we support, and that's the closest we're going to get to a definition right now.
Okay, another question from the chat. In your opinion, what do you think is the biggest misconception about racial equity?
It's a great one. Jess, do you want to take that one?
It's a good one. Nigel touched on this one earlier, but I mean, we get a lot of questions, a lot of pings, and it's actually me personally, I get this a lot. I was like, have you thought about really focusing in and including we got one very specific the other day. It was the Jewish Canadian immigrant experience into your work. And I think it's that. I think people just need to really understand that right now we are focused on specifically the American Black experience, because that is the one that needs the most attention right now. And Nigel gave the answer as to why earlier. And so we need to have our folks understand your experience is important. Your lived experience is super important. But right now we just got to focus on the Black American experience. And we really lean into this idea that rising tide lift all boats. We want to see the outcomes. We want to see the impact. And once we do that, we can see what works, what doesn't. And then we can help, other folks of different lived experience and have that, go to them.
Yeah. Jessica, can you do another one back to back? There's one in the chat. Margot, if it's okay, if I could pull one out for us to discuss. What do you think about the usual design thinking, human-centered design approaches? Would they need to be revisited to even be more inclusive and human-centered?
Absolutely, 100%, right? We really lean into this idea and thought here that everything is a prototype, right? But really over the past year and a half, design and design culture here at IBM has really been leaning into thinking about what are the unintended consequences of things that we create, of things that we make as designers. And so that's why we really need to revisit every practice, honestly, that we do as designers, bring in those diverse and empowered teams, bring in those folks of different lived experiences, cultures, races, you name it, to understand, what are going to be the unintended consequences of things that we create and that we make in this world.
One of the most timely conversations we had was about persona development. And, for the one person who doesn't know what a persona is, sort of this representation of an aggregate of a human being, and we try to design for that aggregated person. We usually give that person a name, and we go from there. It allows lots of people to empathize very quickly with who we're designing for. The challenge is, how do you represent equity in 4 prototypes or 3 or 7? They're clearly, what about somebody who happens to have a disability? What about an older person, a younger person, living at home person, a family father? Like, there's so many different experiences in humanity. How can you avoid unintentional bias in something as simple as, well, it's not simple, something as fundamental as persona making? And we don't have the perfect answer, but we're working hard at it. And we've got a work group just working on that as they do our research. And, stay connected to us, and maybe there's something that we could publish and bring to the design community overall. But just the work I've seen so far is about having an additional layer of abstraction called a context, and for the work, you might aggregate um, all of the research into more psychological states rather than simply depending on the rendering of an avatar in a skin color. And so that we eliminate at least some of the personal identifiers that come with the physical rendering of a persona. And therefore, when you're in a meeting, you're not looking at a white woman or a black man or this or that. You might be looking at some other more generic visualization, and then the concepts of that persona can shine through rather than the superficial. That's not perfect though. So again, we're in this space where social sciences intersect with business, and I'd love for one of you, my colleagues at your institution, to help us on this one, because somebody's got some answers here. We just need to find the right people to help us with them.
I have a question. So with different team members that have different learning curves and different past experiences, how do you deal with those that say, I don't see an issue, or I'm tired of talking about this? How do you approach that?
We haven't had to answer it directly yet. I think that there's a lot of buy-in still 2 years after the summer of 2000, a year and a half, almost coming up on 2 years, to where we still are in this phase that I still call a honeymoon phase, where we're not asked to justify the work, we just do the work. And people love that. There's this one scene, and if folks want to do me a favor, and Jessica, maybe you can find it and link to it. America by Design, season 1, episode, I think ours is 5, maybe it's 6. But look at the episode that has me in it, has IBM in it. And I take the producers on a field trip in Austin. And we go to the top of one of the parking garages near the main central business district, downtown Austin. Austin is a city that is full of segregation to this day, not because it's legally happened, but because of the following. And here's why I give this answer to you, Margot. The institution still exists. Just because it's been removed from the headlines doesn't mean that the effects are gone. And you can look out your window almost in any city in America and see this happen. There's an interstate that goes right down the center of the city, north-south. It divided what they created called the Negro Zone from the white folks in 1925. So the east side of Austin is for black folks. The central part and the west part is where the lake and the hills are. And if you stand on that parking garage, and I think there's a different term in the UK, so forgive me that. But if you stand on the top of this building and look towards the west, you can see the University of Texas, you see the state capitol building just south of that, and then you see downtown. So you have access to education and higher learning, access to government, and access to business, commerce. Completely unavailable to all black folks from the dawn of time until 1968 or so, a few years before I was born. And the way they moved black folks from the prosperous sections of town to the black Negro zone was they turned off their public utilities. And they said, and then the banks only lent to black folks if they went to the east side and tried to buy a home. You then pan the camera and look at the development, the shiny buildings, the university on the west side of the freeway, and then pan it to the east side of the freeway and you don't see any development. It is being redeveloped and gentrified, which is a second slap in the face to black folks, because now the black folks that were kicked out and put on that side of town that was not as desirable created the projects in the high crime district. In the early 2000s, now it's central. And now it costs $1 million to buy a very small, relatively speaking, home over there. So that's twice that the institutional legacy of racism impacts people today. So if you were black and you're born in Austin in this from the dawn of time until the 90s, you likely grew up in a neighborhood that did not have access. So I know this is a long answer because it's a difficult question to answer, but I best can explain it visually through that journey if you went with me. You will still see these divides all over the country. Go to Chicago, go to New York City, go to, and I think it exists in other countries as well, where the impacts are still here. And those people that were born in the 70s, 80s, 90s, they're our age. So if you don't think that that still has an impact and therefore a need, then you're just not paying attention to the information. If people don't want to pay attention to the information, Margot, I don't have anything for them. We need enlightenment. We need people that are ready to prototype. We need people that are ready to fail fast and move quickly and turn over a new leaf and help guide those who are less able to see the actual information along with us.
Thank you. We have a question from one of our colleagues, Leila. She's asking, how can design education and educators in the field, what can we do to help feed the pipeline and promote racial equity in the field?
Jessica? If you don't want to,
I'm in the process of Googling. So we've got a group of designers here internally and externally that are actually looking at redefining design education. Here, I'll put the URL in the chat here. And they're working with Don Norman as well, who I guess is considered the grandfather of design, but they're bringing in a bunch of different designers of color into this process to just relook at the design industry as a whole. But design education in itself, I mean, we actually did this. We prototyped a new curriculum for the IBM Accelerate program that we taught over the summer, where not only was it delivered by designers of color, but it was created by designers of color. And the very first 2 lessons were really leaning into, again, and I touched on this earlier, but that notion of really thinking about the unintended consequences of design, looking at structures of power, everything that we bring as humans to our design processes. But that's representation, number one. It totally matters, right? If you've got an institution of mostly white men, it is going to be, a little interesting there for designers of color to go through that program. If you have folks that look like, other students who want to get into these types of programs, representation is going to increase tenfold, 100%. So representation, and then just re-looking at education as a whole and how we can, educate the industry.
The other thing that we're doing as well, thank you, Jessica, is with our inaugural appointee to the IBM Honorary Design Scholar, Dr. Miller. She's a doctor of theology. She's a mid-century graphic designer who came up through the 50s and 60s, was excluded from the old boys club, an American term probably, but she was not allowed to practice her work freely, but she still built an agency and had a very successful career all the way through the early 2000s. I fell in love with the concept of bringing her into our fold because she's got stories to tell